Hello, everybody. It's 6 o'clock. So welcome to our May Authors Talk, concluding a series that has framed urban issues that we started back in January with a talk by Robert Fishman about planning and the 100th anniversary of the Regional Plan Association, focusing especially on transit. So to bookend the series, Bob is going to be the discussant for the presentation by Nicholas Dagen Bloom on his new book, The Great American Transit Disaster, A Century of Austerity, Auto-Centric Planning, and White Flight. So Nick Bloom is a good friend of the Skyscraper Museum, a colleague as an urban historian and a planner. He's a professor at Hunter College, where he directs the program of urban policy and planning. And he has been there for a couple of years, and before that at New York Institute of Technology, where he was a professor who brought into the kind of circle of the Skyscraper Museum as the guest curator, another colleague of his, Matthias Altwicker, to do an exhibition that we did here called Housing Density. Nick is an expert on numerous topics, and you're going to hear about transit tonight, but what the exhibition on housing density that we did here at the museum really expanded on and also focused work that Nick has been doing for many years on public housing, one of his favorite topics. So he has written many books, and by way of introducing him, I'm going to go to the next slide on my screen here to show you a picture from the website that accompanies this book that markets the Great American Transit Disaster by a website that debunks transit myths. And so one of these pages of this very well-designed website that you can visit yourself, you see here along with the book cover, and also a picture of Nick, who you're going to see live in just a moment. But I'm putting this up here in part so you can see another page of the website, but also because it contains the name of quite a few of his other books, including The Public Housing That Worked, and the Metropolitan Airport on the theme of transportation, How States Shaped Post-War America, and a whole host of other topics. So as I introduce Nick and invite him in a moment to come onto the screen, I want to recall and direct you to a video that's archived on our website that I've already mentioned back from last January, where Bob Fishman, who is emeritus professor from the University of Michigan in the School of Architecture and Planning there, where he taught for many years. And he is the author also of several books, and very relevantly to this week's conversation, especially in the New York Times, in an article by Ginia Belafonte that I will show you in just a moment. He addresses the idea of transit and suburbanization and housing. So really kind of bringing together these topics that Nick has worked on, certainly, and over the years and specialized in, seems to be, I wanted to insert at the outset that question, because we will have a Q&A if there's time after the conversation. So I do invite people to put your questions into the Q&A function. And if we have time at the end of the conversation around 7 o'clock, then we will entertain some of your questions. But Nick will talk for about 45 minutes, and then there'll be a conversation between Bob and Nick. So, so directing you to this talk that Bob gave back earlier in the year to start our series that focused on New York. He talked about hyperbolically, as he explains, how planners saved New York. And other of the top, and this is the article from just last Sunday's Time, Building in the Suburbs and the Housing Crisis. And as it happens, Ginia Belafonte cites Bob's 1987 book on bourgeois utopias that looked at the history of suburbanization. So with that set of credentials and the library of volumes on the topics of suburbanization and transportation and public housing. I'm going to invite Nick to come on to the screen with his camera and to share the screen as I stop mine. I will continue to be off camera as Nick and Bob engage in conversation at the end of the talk. So Nick Bloom, take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Carol, for inviting me this evening. I am honored to be here and honored to be part of many of the activities of the Skyscraper Museum. And I have to say that I got into urban history and planning in large measure because of Bob Fishman's work, including Utopia. So I am honored to be here. Let me close this so I don't have this. Okay. Well, hi and good evening. I am delighted to talk about the new book, The Great American Transit Disaster, from University of Chicago Press. And without further ado, I will begin. Sorry, a sec. So, you know, one of the animating question of this book, let me start my timer right here, was the destruction and subsequent poor quality of mass transit inevitable in 20th century America? I think if you ask many people, including many urban historians and others, they would say yes, right? That the rise of the automobile culture basically made it inevitable that the transit would become completely sort of subsumed by this auto culture. And I group this under what I would call a transit fatalism, right? This idea that the creation of the interstate highway system, the enormous power of the auto industry, and in the famous streetcar conspiracies, right? That where you have the automotive industry bankrolling the national city lines to buy up a number of urban transit systems and junk them, replace the streetcars with buses, that it was basically an inevitable outcome that we would have terrible transit, almost no transit in the United States. And in fact, of course, you know, when you look at what happens to transit in the US, that certainly looks, and you look at these sort of drops, particularly from the 1940s to the 70s, which is the focus of my book, it certainly does look like you really can't have much of a transit culture if you have a car culture. Really, you know, this is the rapid transit, this is bus service, and this is the streetcar lines, right? So there are massive losses, and you know it's easy to see why people would find the streetcar conspiracy so compelling. But if we step back for a minute and look around the country for a minute, there are some interesting patterns that I think raise questions about the inevitableness of the loss of transit cultures in the United States. If you look regionally, there are very big differences, East, West Coast versus, for instance, the South and some of the upper Midwest that indicate, you know, cities having more transit ridership than others. And that's interesting as a kind of outlier, right? These sort of outlier cities. And then if you even go on the East Coast, you have quite a range of transit going up and down the 95 corridor from, of course, New York, where I am, but also Philadelphia having a lot of legacy transit, Baltimore having very little legacy transit, and DC having a comprehensive system. So those also, to my mind, raise questions about the inevitability of, you know, an auto culture overwhelming transit. And of course, you can look around the world, whether in Canada and Europe and other places, cars are extraordinarily popular, and yet they also have invested in mass transit. And an interesting kind of little moment we're in right now with the pandemic is that, you know, San Francisco's downtown is probably one of the worst off right now in terms of visitors and business and so forth, things like that, with, you know, 31% of pre-pandemic levels. And Muni, you know, you hear about a lot of BART, which is the regional transit system, but Muni, which is the bus and trolley coach and some of the old streetcar, you know, modernized streetcars, you know, there were massive losses initially with the pandemic, but we see a year to year, a steady increase in ridership. And so it's examples like this that, you know, I think raise questions about the idea that, you know, if you have the, you know, a car culture, that doesn't mean, you know, it means inevitably you will not have much transit. So I try to account for in this book, you know, what determines whether you have more or less transit. So in order to kind of get at those differences and those differentiations and away from inevitability, I am a historian. So I looked into 6 cities, and you see them listed here. and divide them by, primarily they're divided along the lines of transit financing. And so if you love things like, fares and, the stories of fares and transit finance and equipment and all that kind of stuff like that, I think you'll find the book very exciting. But in any case, there are three major categories: the private unsubsidized systems like Baltimore and Atlanta, which were basically unsubsidized at this really key moment, I believe, from the 30s and 40s until 1970 or so, when both those systems, for instance, were bought out by the public. These were, almost all American transit was a private enterprise. And these were systems which were private and unsubsidized until the 60s and early 70s. And this was typical across the country. And you basically have a rolling bankruptcy essentially for these. Then we have another set of cities looked at, the public unsubsidized. These were rare, but I would say these were also deeply problematic. This was Chicago, Detroit. These were relatively early to public ownership. Problem was that they were designed from the beginning to basically get all the revenue from fares. And that really didn't work out very well, as you will find out. And then finally, I don't want to leave people with this idea again, this helps understand the differentiation. There were cities that basically began subsidizing transit earlier, like Boston, San Francisco, New York, relatively rare, but those are the cities where you have a lot more transit. And, as the title of the book encapsulates some of this, there are three major themes that underlie these case studies and determine how much transit there's really going to be. To what extent was financial austerity something that the transit agencies had to face, whether public or private, over many decades? Did they have enough money for operations? And second is auto-centric planning. What was the context in which transit operates? We don't really talk about that, as when more and more we are about transit-oriented development has come back as a concept, right? But it's crucial to how well a transit system operates, and to the extent that a city basically invested, or I should say a city basically had policies that, preserve density and made it more difficult to drive, we see more transit riding. And then there is the question of white flight and disinvestment. Cities that basically had extreme forms of white flight and disinvestment, those were usually centered in the areas where the legacy transit was. So to the extent that cities basically went down these paths of austerity and auto-centric planning and disinvestment, you basically see very little transit survive. So I'd like to start with Baltimore, my hometown I'm from, and talk a little bit about what happened to private unsubsidized transit in a city like Baltimore. And Baltimore is an interesting case study. I'll show you in a minute why. But I do want you to look at this map here of the transit system circa the late 30s, early 40s. And what you can see here is that you have a very dense network of streetcar and bus lines in basically the northwest corridor here, the west side and the east sides of town. And I want you to kind of keep those in mind as I go through this. Baltimore was, into the 1940s, a city with a lot of transit. Definitely already had the BTC already was having trouble. It's basically functionally bankrupt in the 1930s. And it was bought out by the National City Lines in the 1940s, in 1945. And so this does, this is sort of where, there is a transit myth busting component. You have this very powerful corporation coming in, or, holding company, kind of like a modern hedge fund, buying up essentially these troubled transit companies. What happens in Baltimore is the combination of what I would say private and public austerity basically drives the transit down. It's not just the Baltimore Transit Company, which would be owned by this National City Lines, but it's also decisions made by local leaders. And a lot of the book is about local decision-making in cities, also states, that basically undermine transit. So yes, the Baltimore Transit Company was very interested in replacing streetcars with buses. It would save them money on labor, on maintaining all that infrastructure, and try to get a profit from it. As their ridership declined, and they are a capitalist enterprise, they reduce service very rapidly too. That was another. So they're basically always rebalancing their budgets by cutting service, particularly in the post-war years, as Baltimoreans, as in other cities, bought cars and they lost riders. So they were basically rapid service reduction. They would basically cut year to year. rapid fare increases, which would also alienate riders and cut down on rides. When all of that even didn't work out, in the 50s and 60s, they basically deferred maintenance, didn't buy new equipment. And certainly they did very little expansion or modernization over time. So, that part of the, that streetcar myth, which affects about 40 out of 1,200 transit operators in the country, certainly, was not a great news for them. But as I'm going to show, the city and the state made a lot of decisions that accelerated the decline of transit in a city like Baltimore. And so, there were multiple discussions over many decades about whether the transit system should be publicly owned. And it was either rejected in many cases, and into the 1960s, delayed by what was a new regional transit agency, the MTA. The city also, beginning as early as the 20s and 30s, began pushing for streetcar replacement and removal. They wanted to speed up traffic. They wanted the streetcars out of the streets. And they did everything they could to help the BTC, the Baltimore Transit Company, basically get rid of its transit or its streetcar lines. They did not provide public subsidies, and we can debate, the difficulties of providing public subsidies to private companies, but they didn't do it. And even worse, they taxed the companies into the 1960s, what were park taxes and so forth, basically taking money from this transit operator, which was operating a near break-even public utility. So what did you end up with in Baltimore by, let's say, about 1970 and then into the 80s and 90s? You ended up, certainly by the 50s and 60s, with what I would consider second-tier bus service. This is a sort of classic image of Baltimore buses. These are the buses that the type of buses I rode in the 1980s in Baltimore going to school. So on one hand, you had a pretty limited bus network left behind. And then once you had public ownership after 1970, the powers that be, who were very strong in the area, their emphasis there was on rapid transit, and particularly a kind of commuter, and we'll talk about this with Bob, right? This idea of linking the suburbs, right, these suburban areas with the downtown. So it really was about, in the post-1970, where there's federal money coming in and so forth, state money and so forth, that it really was about reaffirming the centrality of the business district and not necessarily offering transit quality to the remaining riders. And so you ended up with a very limited system, as you see here in Baltimore, of light rail and then one rapid line. But we also have to step back a little bit and think about, what is this, why did transit have so many problems, right? And there are a number of reasons why the BTC certainly wasn't interested in investing further in transit. You can look at the zoning. So zoning comes into play in Baltimore in the 1920s. Baltimore was a city that had expanded multiple times. And in the last major expansion, which is this area out here, what was called the annex, almost all of that area was basically, single family or at least low density zoning. And, that is, very important from the perspective of the transit company, because they know, if they run lines out there, they're just not going to get that many riders. So that is, and of course, there are areas very well set up for automobiles, right? Parking and driving and so forth. At the same time, they were basically putting off saving transit. City leaders, even before the Interstate Highway Act of 1956, were investing in parkways and also highways. Bonds were basically approved by the public for the creation of highways. Ultimately, it will be, the creation of the interstate system creates an even more expansive system. The highways that they begin working on, like the East Side Expressway, the West Side Expressway, excuse me, here, which you see part of here, it's called the Highway to Nowhere, as it's known, also was just helped destroy parts of the densely populated West Side, which by this time was a primarily African-American neighborhood. So you have, not only is it offering a new speedy route to drivers, but it is also, the highway programs were simultaneously undermining the most transit-rich areas of the city. And this was typical nationally. There's another kind of interesting story here about Henry Barnes arrives in Baltimore in 1953, and he was basically their traffic commissioner. And his goal always was to speed up cars. And the way he was big into doing that was by creating one-way streets. And the problem with one-way streets for transit was that you had streetcar lines that basically were in streets going different directions, so forth. So he was an advocate for about 10 years of streetcar removal, aggressive streetcar removal. And he did favor buses. He created some bus express lanes for rush hours, but it was all about speeding up cars. That was his thing. Then he would come to New York and do the same thing here to speed up car traffic here. Then, along with that was that sort of aligned with this was the urban renewal program in Baltimore. And what you see right here is Charles Center, Inner Harbor, or Charles Center at this point. And this was a massive redevelopment project that targeted the, an old part of the city. And when it replaced this densely developed area with a very car-friendly area, lots of parking underneath it. And also as part of this development in the early 60s, they demanded, basically the wealthy, powerful business leaders who were behind this, demanded the removal of the last two streetcar lines. And the city leaders got behind this, and they basically forced the BTC to remove these actually excellent suburban to urban streetcar links that were still there, pretty popular, and replace them with buses because they actually went through this urban rural area and they didn't like that. All right, so they basically that was by 1963, the last two streetcar lines were gone, even though they actually had tremendous potential for upgrading. The other side of what city leaders and state leaders did to undermine transit was basically sign off on disinvestment, redlining, and discrimination in housing. This led to, as I mentioned, these east and west sides and northwest sides of town were areas which had a lot of transit riders, primarily African-American by the post-war period, and east and west sides. And these were areas which suffered from tremendous disinvestment, which you can see what they called blight in this period. And that undermines transit too, because over time you're going to lose riders, the density will slip. African-American families began moving further out from where the best transit was. The commercial districts, which were along transit lines, began to go into decline. People had fewer reasons to visit. And at the same time, these city and also particularly county leaders in this period created a very lax system of land use controls that allowed for tremendous white flight to a highly segregated, what was then a highly segregated Baltimore County, with low density sprawl of commerce and also housing, which again, very difficult to serve by transit, not economical in this sense, very difficult to sort of pull that off. And what we see over time is because of the basically disinvestment central areas and the growing populated suburbs, we also have a Black migration outward, away from the transit-rich areas into the suburbs themselves, which you can see here, 1960 and then 2019. You can see this movement outward to areas that had almost no transit at all. And also, as I mentioned, these neighborhoods go into a spiral in the 1960s with the riots in Baltimore and then subsequent disinvestment, which basically leads to a loss of population density, which undermines transit. And if you want to see it mapped, which a lot of people do today, right, you can see what Baltimore transit ridership looks like in 1960 versus 2000. And as I mentioned, these east and west sides, some of the northwest, these were areas with significant transit ridership. You can see in 2000, it has thinned out significantly. And I should point out, these 1960 figures are much reduced from, let's say, 1945, when there were many more riders. So you have reduction by 1960 and then even more reduction by 2000. But it's not just, again, I mentioned that Baltimore, these private companies were the dominant model in the US. But it wasn't just Baltimore that had these kinds of problems. You can look at Atlanta. It was not an NCL, no national city lines. It's hard to make it a streetcar conspiracy. They had wonderful electric trolley bus system, and yet they made a lot of the same choices. Don't subsidize the system. Let it fall apart until about 1970. And this is what happens to your ridership there. And again, similar pattern of near-in African-American neighborhoods where there were riders, and then here's 2000, right? A dispersal. And this is despite spending billions of dollars on a rapid lines and two major rapid lines and so forth. You have a major loss of population and in those close neighborhoods and also ridership. So that's kind of a typical story for the American city in this period. So you can say, well, why not? Let's just do public ownership. That should work better. Well, there's good public ownership in the sense of, having the resources it needs. And then there's kind of dysfunctional public ownership. And we can look at Chicago, which basically takes over its private companies in 1945. And, Chicago, this is a very sad story. By 1945, Chicago had probably one of the world's greatest streetcar networks, maybe under a single ownership. Those are the red lines you see here. They had this elevated system that was a rapid transit line. It was a system that was built with private capital, right? Again, there were real estate interests involved in that, but that was really great to have a system like that developed in private capital. But the problem is the CTA, which is created in 45, is a pay-as-you-go model until 1970, and that is a disaster. There's no question about it, because they didn't have the money to fully modernize their systems, and every year they had to balance their books. And Chicago, as in other cities, Chicago urban residents, as in Baltimore, a lot of them bought cars, suburbanites bought cars, and so they had major losses in the post-war era. And so they basically had to figure out how to pay their way. So what did they do? As in cities elsewhere, they basically got rid of their streetcars. In about a decade, from the mid-40s to the late 50s, they removed their entire streetcar network. It was not an NCL city again. And that's bad. But they did actually start by replacing their streetcars with these good buses, including propane buses and trolley coaches and so forth. So that's great. Except that, they, with these economies, they couldn't make it pay and balance their books. So they did things like raising fares, cutting service, especially overnight and weekends, cutting maintenance, right? And not doing a lot of expansion. And basically you have this, what is one of the great transit cities in the world decline into basically a second-rate system by the 1970s. And, part of also pay as you go, I mentioned about limited expansion, they're not moving, they're not basically building much in the way of expansion out to these growing suburbs. Chicago was one of the few cities that actually did really kind of innovative transit in highways, but those basically did not get as far as where most of these suburbanites were going, and they were limited in scale. Limited expansion, but boy, did they go for highways in the Chicago region, right? And so they did a lot of highway development, and you can see this is within, some of these are within the Chicago city limits, plenty of cars being purchased out here. And if you wanted to go north-south in Chicago now, right, in an outer area, you were much better off in a highway. So they created, even before they began creating it, even before the Interstate Highway Act of 56, and that sort of supercharged it, they created a highway system that was spectacularly, faster and more efficient than the transit system, which they were starving, during this period. If you go out to the suburbs, it gets even worse, because you do have a lot of potential transit-oriented development in places like Winnetka, which you see here. You can see there's a little bit of, density around, these commuter rail lines, but these communities basically downzoned themselves beginning in the 20s, made sure that there would not be the kind of density needed to support transit in the long term. There's another story in most American cities. I mentioned Baltimore, this Charles Center, but the urban renewal story, that definitely contributes to transit's problems. And you can, urban renewal has multiple dimensions: the highways, public housing, middle income redevelopment. You see in Chicago on this map, on this particular south side where there are elevated lines, there are a whole series of public housing projects. Initially, they're, even though there are towers in the park, there was some density population. But over time, the towers were not maintained, population density went down. You can even see some of these projects were not very densely developed at all. And so that wasn't great, considering this is your transit line, which used to run through very dense neighborhoods. And then it gets even worse for middle-class developments, which you see here, which is Lake Meadows, and right in the heart of the city, near transit lines, you have parking lots and big fields. So that's not great for transit either. And then, as I mentioned in Baltimore, city leaders basically moved very slowly, and state leaders on sort of an ending housing discrimination, well, not ending, but even addressing housing discrimination, disinvestment in neighborhoods. And what that meant was that neighborhoods that basically, were ones built around transit with these dense commercial districts would go into decline, as you see here. And again, you would lose population, you would lose commercial vitality because of these racist policies. And as in Baltimore, what happens is a lot of the core riders of transit, whether African-American or Latino, in Chicago, would basically begin moving further south away from areas of really great transit. There's some commuter rail lines, or even further, way further out. And again, you begin losing a lot of your core riders through this kind of policies. And you can see in Chicago, now again, this 1960s is the first time you have transit on a census maps. You can see that it looks pretty dense. It's not too bad, but this is already way down, at least half or less of what the 1940s numbers were, like in the end of the war. And then you can see 2000, you can see the thinning of ridership, certainly on the south side, the west side, and so forth, as neighborhoods declined, as the systems got less reliable, as people bought cars, right, and took to highways. If you want to see an even more extreme example of this, I have the discussion and a history of Detroit's public transit. And again, you'd think, well, Detroit should have a good record. Public ownership starts in the 20s. It's very innovative, right? This should be great. But unfortunately, they built it as a pay-as-you-go model. And so out went the streetcars, out went the good bus service, right? Less and less service available. And you can see between 1960 and 2000, massive losses. And of course, this aligns too with the tremendous disinvestment, the loss of factories, and so forth that happened, I've talked about in Chicago and Baltimore, particularly with African-American neighborhoods. Well, I don't want to leave you completely, sad about the potential, right? Because I do think choices matter. The choices that city governments make, that state governments make, that federal governments make about transit has a lot to do with how much transit you have left and how many riders you have. So let's talk about Boston briefly as an example of better sort of transit outcomes, if you will. Did Boston, have many of the same kinds of contextual choices that undermine transit? Yes. All right. So you definitely have very destructive highway programs, which knocked out, very dense neighborhoods. You had horrible urban renewal projects that knocked out whole neighborhoods. You had redlining and disinvestment in African-American neighborhoods. You also had low density zoning on a regional basis. The question is, how did it happen to go a different way? So what kind of pro-transit choices were made? Well, the first is that beginning the Boston Elevated basically goes bankrupt as early as 1918, 1919, right after World War I. And that's when people are still riding, but for various reasons, including their inability to get the fare increases they want, so forth, they're unable to basically balance their books. And so you end up with a trusteeship, a form of public management until 1947. And what happens is in this year of 1919 is they create a regional transit funding situation where Boston, any of the cities basically served by the major service of the transit operator, the elevated lines and so forth, the streetcar lines, basically had to contribute a subsidy. And that was crucial, for instance, as early as the 1930s, to basically maintain the system. It was also crucial for, in the 1920s, they also begin to, or they continue to expand the system, the rapid transit system expand. That's rare in the United States, not unheard of, but it's these kinds of subsidies that make that happen. They're able to maintain fares at a low level for a long time. That helps keep riders. Low fares are crucial to this because they had the subsidies to make up a lot of their losses. They have plans for and do some true regional expansion as part of meeting the ridership in these more far-flung areas. They engage in some forms of modernization. They have the money to do that. And the city leaders engage in highway cancellation under intense citizen pressure. So let's jump into these a little bit. So I mentioned regional service. I mean, this is just sort of an accident of history in some ways. You know, Boston is a relatively small city, but the urbanized area, right, is much larger, and it includes a whole number of different, what some people consider to be suburban cities, but are essentially urbanized at a moderate density. But they were also served by this, you know, the elevated company, which basically ran streetcars, elevated lines, eventually buses and trolley coaches. And because the municipal boundaries of Boston were so small, there really was, when the government basically gets involved as early as 1919, you couldn't just preserve, let's say, Boston's transit. You had to come up with a regional scheme. So the state basically gets involved, the state government. And they're very early to this because there's really no choice if you wanted to maintain this system, you had to do a regional taxation scheme because you couldn't do it without having like Cambridge involved, right, in this, because that service also extended into Cambridge and Somerville. So they come up with a regional tax system because it's a regional system to begin with. Then they make a lot of plans, and I have a lot of in the book, different kinds of plans. They say, well, we're doing regional taxation, so we really have to do regional expansion as well. And so they have a whole series of expansion plans. Now, you know, most of these plans took decades more than anyone thought, were more expensive and so forth. But as I mentioned, beginning in the 20s, you have expansion of rapid transit or continued expansion of rapid transit in Boston, in the Boston region. And then this will continue in the post-war era with the Blue Line expansion, Red Line expansion, Orange Line modernization, Green Line modernization, and so forth. So part of having that regional taxation scheme was the idea that you had to give something to these places that were getting taxed, right? That was part of the story. But, you know, I don't think this would have worked as well had there not been so much highway cancellation in Boston. And this, again, comes out of citizen activism. There were very destructive highways in Boston, but there were also some very important cancellations that basically kept driving terrible and aggravating. And I think that was very important for transit in a place like Boston, not only because it keeps it awful, but also you're basically not, you know, wiping out as many areas, large areas. And as I mentioned, citizen activism was crucial. One of those corridors that was basically saved from having a highway was repurposed in part for transit. That becomes the Orange Line's extension. It also has other kind of community facilities along it. This is the 1970s and 80s development that really kind of creates a new model for what mass transit can do for neighborhoods. And then there is the question of diversity, regional diversity. Now, it is the case that San Francisco, Boston, New York to a certain extent, had a relatively small African-American population as a percentage compared to Baltimore, Chicago, and so forth. And I think that's one factor in why, you know, for instance, there were more, generally speaking, there was more public support in a city like Boston. There were a lot more white riders, like college students and academics. And for instance, in wealthy areas like Brookline and Cambridge and so forth, there was a white ridership that valued transit, like out in wealthy suburbs. You can look at, we'll talk about, you know, the MTA bailout that recently happened. And some of that had to do with the fact that, you know, you have a regional kind of commuter shed. So that was important for preserving transit in these cities. But I would say that particularly post-65 with immigration, diversification of areas, that the growing diversity of population in these cities has been crucial to transit maintenance. And we don't really talk about it enough, even for New York, how important immigration has been to transit. And this has basically brought riders back. But here's the key, right? Just because you have immigration doesn't mean you're going to have a lot of transit. You only get that ridership if you preserve the transit. And I think that's the difference. Like, you know, you'll get riders if you preserve the transit. If you've lost your transit, you won't, there's basically not much for anybody to ride. So I think that is an important part of the story too. And you can see now, again, Boston by 1960 had lost a lot of ridership, but in fact, they, you know, it more or less stabilizes through these various efforts. And I should add that the kinds of subsidies that Boston enjoys, or San Francisco, or even New York, are far and away larger than were ever envisioned, even in the early years of when subsidized transit was made. And that has to do with the increasing costs and so forth of transit. But what that means is even like post-COVID, what we see in Boston, and despite like some big problems with transit there, they had to close down the Orange Line for a month and so forth. But we do see, particularly, we do see, some uptick here, but certainly even this year, some uptick. They're still moving about 725,000 weekday riders, even post-COVID, and their downtown is not doing great. So that gives you a little sense of that kind of what it means to preserve transit, have transit there, and also actually very moderate cost transit. I also have a chapter on San Francisco, and there again, you have very early 20th century subsidization of transit through local property taxes. They create a very successful publicly owned system that ultimately takes over a privately owned system it was competing with. And as you can see here, relative consistency between 1960 and 2000, transit ridership basically maintained, but not without a great struggle. There were enormous losses in San Francisco in transit. It was well known that they were running lots of empty buses, trolley buses, and streetcars. They ripped out almost all their streetcar lines. They just kept a couple of them, replaced them with buses and trolley buses. They had highways and so forth, but they did make a lot of pro-transit choices. And I would list subsidization being very important as part of that, but also massive highway cancellation, which basically kept transit in a competitive situation. As I mentioned, you can, I think, see part of this resiliency of transit in a city like Boston through, you have basically a central business district in deep, having major problems with loss of workers and so forth and activity. And yet, as I mentioned, despite, you have this massive loss, but then year to year, over the years, we see a slow, steady uptick because transit is so kind of part of the city's fabric. You have the density preserved, you have limited highway, and so it's very difficult to drive and so forth. And so you see a very slow recovery. But they had to run a lot of empty buses and so forth, and they have big losses. And in California, as in other states, right, there's this, again, this is about choices, right? Will you basically kind of help transit survive through a difficult period and sort of see what happens on the other side? New York, basically through tremendous activism on the part of rider organizations, politicians, and others, we have struck a deal to basically preserve the MTA through massive new subsidies, and we're going to get congestion pricing. In California, we'll see, they're debating it, right? So what I just talked about for San Francisco may not last if they are forced ultimately to make cuts to basically balance budgets in a more draconian way. So there are always opportunities, I would say, to save transit. So I would say that, the answer to my question about inevitability is it is not. I do not think, and I think the book provides plenty of evidence along this line, and I would promote the book here, that the destruction and subsequent poor quality of mass transit in 20th century America was not inevitable, right? Clearly, we're not going back to some, transit utopia in the US, but I think there's plenty of evidence that you can have a car culture and you can also have transit. But in order to do that, you have to make some choices. You have to make a few pro-transit choices around things like preserving diverse neighborhoods, African-American neighborhoods, immigrant neighborhoods, not expanding highways all the time, encouraging greater density, not making, lots of space for cars everywhere, right? Changing zoning. So I do see some bright signs on the horizon because there are big changes going on. I do think, the minimum, right, that you need to do is to make a certain number of pro-transit choices to get transit quality in a car-centric society. So on that note, actually, I finished relatively quickly. So I'm happy about that. And I guess I'll turn it over to Bob or Carol first.
Well, I'm inviting Bob to come on the screen, and I will disappear as soon as he does. But Nick, thank you. That was an amazing summary of fantastically impressive research, even if you didn't talk about New York. So now I will leave as Bob Fishman does take over in order to both respond and I suppose, continue and expand the conversation. So Bob, take it over.
Okay, thank you. I hope everyone can hear me.
I can hear you, Bob.
Okay,
Yes.
good. Thank you. Well, thank you, Nick, for just for an amazing talk, and even more so for an amazing book.
Thank you.
I think that that as you showed, to have any larger grasp of the issue of transit, you have to know an incredible amount about each locality. And I think your book is the first one to really attain that that knowledge of what was happening in these different places, so that we could really begin to answer this question of what happened to transit. Another thing I want to thank you for is that with all the talk, the issue of the complexities, you never really lose sight of who the victims are, of who that for the vast majority of white middle-class Americans, transit wasn't a disaster because they could pivot away from it. You really understand what it meant and means to live in a city where transit is failing. And of course, in so many of these cities, so is public education, so is public safety, so is almost everything else. And I think that human side of the story is a real strength of the book. So thank you.
Thanks.
And I do, as commentator.
No, I'm ready. I'm ready.
Right. I want to get into this issue of inevitability.
Yeah.
Because it's not inevitable. So why, in other words, so why did so many of the places you were talking about make such bad decisions? What are the deeper forces that are operating so strongly against transit? I mean, I would put, the issue that your book raises in this way, that, if you go back to the teens and 20s, the United States had, virtually all of our great cities had, rail-based transit that was the envy of the world. And with the coming of the automobile, one could hope and even expect that the automobile system, as it would be built out, would complement transit. Mm-hmm. And, and the two would take mobility to a higher level. That was certainly the aim and ideal of the first Regional Plan Association of New York in the 1920s. And as you show, it doesn't happen. Instead, there is the Great American Transit disaster. So what are the forces? And I think, in my brief comments, I want to look more than your book does, at the power of the automobile system, mm-hmm. Going beyond, American love cities. Just make three rapid points, and hopefully, you'll be able to respond. First of all, I think, as we all know, in the United States, transportation is not necessarily, or is not only about moving people. It's all about real estate speculation. Mm-hmm. It's all about the expansion of a metro region, selling lots at the end, mm-hmm. at the edge. And of course, before the automobile, transit was the way. And so it had that tremendous force behind it. But at least in my research, starting maybe as early as, say, 1915 or so, the developers suddenly learned that they could sell lots that were nowhere near a transit line. All you had to do was pave some country roads, get them to an arterial, and so on. So that great force and one more thing is that transit tended to increase density, which we like along the lines, but of course it restricted the ability to sell lots in the areas between the lines. So that great force of real estate speculation, real estate finance suddenly reverses and becomes anti-transit in effect, is pushing the automobile system. The second point I want to make, I mean, might even be a little too obvious, but sometimes it's nice to be obvious, and that is that a transit system requires just tremendous capital investment, to buy, not only the rails, but the cars, a tremendous management issue. It's tough, especially in a context like the United States, where state capacity isn't all that great. I think one of the great advantages of the automobile system is that the public authorities, all they need to do is build the roads. It's not a small thing, but the way it works, the individual goes out and buys her own car.
Your capital costs, right?
Right, are distributed among the whole population.
Yeah.
There isn't you self-manage. You worry about the repairs and so on, and keeping your car on the road. It's in a society where, as I say, state capacity is limited. The relative simplification of the automobile system versus transit gives it an advantage, time and time again. So many times you see, in other words, because of the tremendous expense of these transit systems, you put on the ballot, say, a relatively simple system, a single line. It gets voted down because only 10% or less of the population can reach it. You put on the ballot an elaborate system that reaches 50 or 60%, and it's so expensive people turn it down because of the ridiculous expense. And that happens again and again. The third point I want to make is that I think the automobile, to give the devil their due, that the automobile, what you call auto-centric planning, really mastered the federal system and the way in which federalism actually works or could work in a way that transit never really attempts. And I want to mention a name, Thomas H. McDonald, the director of the Federal Bureau of Public Roads from 1919 to 1953. The amazing structure that he and his staff set up, essentially federal funds moving to state highway departments. The federal government shouldn't even be engaged in road building and so on. So instead, they work through the state agencies, and they have the ability. They don't need to worry about municipal boundaries or county boundaries. Exactly what trips up, central city-based transit again and again. The state-based planning can undertake really successfully and powerfully. But the real genius, I think, of this automobile system is when a few of these state, agencies, such as California and Michigan, invent, that they use, gasoline taxes to create a highway trust fund that can only be used to build highways. So and then, of course, the federal government makes that the basis of the building of the interstates. So you have, in this, as I say, really powerful and I'll have to say creative use of federalism, the automobile system overcomes all the, almost all of the things that you've been, that you show again and again trips up transit. It has this guaranteed funding. It can operate on a regional level without worrying about recalcitrant suburbs and counties and so on. It is, in its way, a tremendous achievement in terms of governance, and that's why I think, I guess the question I want to raise at the end is, why do you think, especially in the 1950s, when urban population was near its peak, central city population was near its peak, manufacturing output, the central cities counted for more than they ever did before or ever would again. Again and again, they accept this straitjacket of raising fares and at the same time, what you call rightly austerity. So you have these two systems, the automobile system that is immensely and creatively funded, and the transit system that, is caught in this, straitjacket of austerity. Just one line from Al Smith that I have to quote in conclusion. He said of pay as you go, the trouble with pay as you go is you don't pay and you don't go. And that sadly is the story of so much of this. I know why you want to put your emphasis otherwise, but I think that the book is telling a story somewhat different than what you perhaps hoped for or intended.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, I don't deny in the book the enormous talent, I guess you would call it, their ability to, of the automotive sector to basically harness these forces of finance, land use, to, so forth. There's no question about it. And I think I guess I'll start with your most specific question first, which relates to all of them. It's like the 50s, right? Why don't these city governments, or regions, right? Most of them, right? I've given some examples where it can happen. It could happen more broadly. Why did they force transit systems into austerity versus the road network? I think, and just from the historical record, it kind of gets back to your other point about making money from land. The Americans got, you mentioned how wonderful this transit systems were in the 20s and 30s. And they got it without paying for it, and I think that is, we sort of talk about the differences between Europe and America, where they basically were, or let's say New York, right, and America, or Boston and America, and so forth, right, where basically you had a much more engaged public role in either financing or subsidizing transit very early when it was a majoritarian concern, which I think is what you're getting at. I think timing was crucial, right? With the cities, whether in Europe or here, that basically got involved in transit while most, regional there was still like this very large sort of majoritarian ridership piece, were ones that basically, kept more of their legacy transit and were able to do better. But I do think by the 1950s, even in those cities, right, when the scale, and this gets more, I think this gets maybe you're kind of like the underlying thing. I think a lot of it is like American individualism and, how that works well. And I do think, and I definitely talk about it in the book, is, this kind of skepticism of the public sector, which I've looked at in public housing, right, and affordable housing and other areas, this fear of the state, of both state government, but also the state more broadly, right, is a factor, right, which is that you already had in the 20th century a pretty robust, and actually late 19th, right? You had a pretty robust expansion of what people considered to be the appropriate role of government, right? I mean, water treatment, right? Public education. We think of these things as like totally like, yeah, that's great. Of course you'll have that, right? But the truth is that was like a tremendous like advocacy and success, right, of the progressive era, right, to basically achieve these things. And so you had this tremendous expansion in government, in these kind of public services, right? and the cost of governments were going up. And you mentioned, yeah, I mean, there was this sort of, this moment, I guess you could say they kind of had this high point of population and what was going on in city centers. But my read is that those city governments were not very well funded in the 50s and 60s already. And there was, even among their voting population, which, by the way, was pretty white in the 50s, right? You have a lot of white mayors. You have an increasingly African-American ridership in transit or going to schools and so forth. You have basically a white population, which is looking at their property taxes, just like today, right? And, they see the entry, right, into transit. I mean, these are actual discussions. I'm not sort of like being, these are things that are discussed in newspapers and reports and so forth. It's like, well, should we do this? Well, look at a city that's doing it. Well, they say it's great, but, it's going to cost, it's going to be expensive, right? And I think that's part, and, this doesn't necessarily undermine totally what you're saying, that the centralized cost of a transit system, because you can go to a press office or they have an annual report, right? It looks very expensive, it looks super expensive. But, in truth, on a per rider basis, if you have the density and things I'm talking about, it's not that bad, and, it can really work out pretty well. So I think that kind of what I see in the kind of resistance to this and why you don't end up with complementarity, right? Because I think you're absolutely right. The cars are awesome in a lot of ways, right? They take you everywhere, like you said, and whatever. There's all these like advantages, but the question is, can you have a complementary system? I'm not saying, I think it's pretty obvious most Americans are going to drive. The question is, how low does it have to go? And I think it goes so low in part because the people making decisions, and I talk about them in the 40s and 50s, the people voting, right, in the 50s, even in cities, right? Who are they? Like, a lot of white voters, right? White mayors who didn't care about transit and resisted, and didn't, it was very obvious who was riding. And I show, with those maps and things like that, who was riding. They were very skeptical about adding another public service that would come out of their tax base. On the question of the simplicity of automobility, I mean, I guess, on the one hand, yeah, it sort of seems that way, right? Because you're right, you just distributed capital costs and you kind of just build the road. But boy, like there's a lot that we look past, I mean, when one person dies on transit or, like there's a crash or something, right? We're like, that's terrible. It goes in the news. My God, how many died last year on the roads? 40,000 people. Like, there are certain kinds of, there are billions of dollars in costs and injury to people. There, you not only have the highways themselves, but you have the maintenance of the entire road network. You have the entire maintenance of the storm sewer network. I mean, all these things, like, it's really, I would say it's pretty complex. You have the insurance industry. It looks sort of simple, but in fact, I think it's an extremely complex operation and extremely costly. But I think that's part of that's that. So, just to sort of come back around, I think we got these sort of centralized systems, the transit networks, for free, right? And they did appear to be complex, troubled, even back into the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And there wasn't, in most American cities, there wasn't that kind of, it couldn't make that kind of ideological leap, right? That there's some value here, right? And so I think I'm not sure that's the answer I have. I'm not sure it answers it.
Okay, I don't know if I have time for a follow-up, but I'll ask it. I'll ask it anyway.
Sure, go for it.
I think that, a really interesting response. And to me, in that context, the most interesting of your chapters was the one on San Francisco.
Yeah.
For the reason that, that they really did see, they undertook that burden of subsidization.
Yeah.
And, so far as I could tell, not as a kind of regional thing, regional burden, but the city itself. And, there's, is there a lesson, what is the magic there that really, in my reading at least, makes it so different, certainly from Los Angeles and virtually every place that you yourself talk about.
Well, I mean, I think they have a fair bit in common with Boston and New York and so forth. Well, I think we need time travel to go back. I think timing, I'm a historian, right? So sometimes there's not an easy advocacy kind of piece out of this, right? That they so early were engaged in transit when basically there were very few cars that people had. And I think that's what most of these cities that have more of the legacy transit have in common, because Chicago had a ton of transit, right? But, it was a private enterprise until 45, right? But in the early 20th century, San Francisco's getting involved and they're creating a tax structure to support it. And, there's a left-wing tradition there. I think that was part of it. I think it was that everyone, people were riding, they hated the private company. And, it's something of a bit of luck, right? They had some very progressive mayors who really kind of created this motion very early. And, there is that path dependency kind of piece that, at once established, right? It was sort of like, okay, post-war losses were even bigger, right? And it's like, okay, what do we do? Well, we raise the millage or whatever, then we can basically kind of like sustain this. And then they found, well, that turned out to be great because like in the late 60s and 70s, the energy crunch or environmental movement was like, it's nice to have transit, right? So I think that timing is an absolutely crucial component, and timing in the sense that, you're not in that phase of trying to convince a whole bunch of drivers, right, to do to fund transit. I think it is very, and we'll talk about Westchester and what Carol put up there. when even in the New York suburbs, right, it's pretty tough getting people, because even most people who live in the New York suburbs, the most transit heavy region in the country, right? A lot of them, I mean, it's changed, like Westchester is different than Long Island and so forth, but you look at congestion pricing in New Jersey, right? That is a tough sell, and that takes, I think we are seeing progress, right? That is, the governor did fund it. And I think a lot of that has to do with, a big difference, I think, between back then, Bob, and today is transit advocacy organizations exist that can embarrass, right? And I think the social equity piece is important from a publicity point of view. It's on Twitter, it's on, YouTube, whatever it is, there's basically a whole world, right, of people now who call out, right? And there's local political leaders, right, who are more diverse than was back then. And they call out politicians, right? You look at what happened around Baltimore, right, and the West Side Red Line and so forth that they're trying to build, right? That there is this, like, you can't, a lot of these things, while they were done in the public, right, they were done by a relatively small number of people elected by what was a kind of growing auto-addicted population within cities themselves. And I think that, so we do see some changes there. So I think that's another thing. And I think also, just on another piece, is there's a lot of emphasis on silver bullet transit solutions, right? Like, oh, it'll be like a streetcar, or, it'll be this or that. And I think one of the big lessons from my book is, no. There's no short, there's no easy road to this, right? Or track to it, right? That transit thrives in places that have certain kinds of qualities in terms of density and, limited parking, limited highways, whatever it is, a funding situation that's stable for decades. You don't put, I love BRT and I love all these new things that are coming in, but those are not necessarily, if you put those into areas that have been disinvested and you don't do a simultaneous, housing program that increases density around the stations, that you don't do, you don't make it harder to drive and park for new apartment buildings, all that kind of stuff, it's very hard to see how you're going to shift a lot of people to transit. So I do think, we transit, because it's organized on an agency basis, is problematic, right? Because we're always just talking about a transit agency, whereas city planning is somewhere else, right? The highway department is somewhere else. Those things really need to be brought together to have successful transit. I see Carol has reappeared.
I've come back because, as you guys know, we're up against the end of our time, but I thought I would take the prerogative of a kind of last question to knit together the beginning and the end of this series, but also to ask you both to reflect on, well, Nick's book, but your shared experience in teaching in a school of planning and architecture. And to ask you, Nick, first, because, well, Bob has already summarized in the beginning of this series why planning matters and how planners saved New York. But I think, Nick, part of the messaging of your book, which makes it clear the complexity of the forces that are involved, politics, voters, which you didn't really talk about, but you accuse quite up front in the book, and various forces of private public transit. Can planners actually learn from some of these items you just suggested about density or car parking? I mean, can planners actually make a difference in, as Bob has argued, they can through their voices and through their, I suppose, consistency over time of insisting on certain messages about transit and valuing transit. But so Nick, what do you think about, teaching in a school of planning? Can you activate planners in order to make better decisions? They didn't in the middle of the 20th century very much.
Well, you barely have to activate them now. I mean, this generation is engaged. I'm sure Bob had the similar, to a great extent, that's really a big, maybe that's a change from other generations, but it's the student population, at least at Hunter, but I think at other schools of planning, is very transit oriented. They're very excited about transportation alternatives, not just transit, but bikes and walking and rethinking streets and rethinking zoning. And I think it's a very exciting time, to be in the planning field, because not only are the students talking about it and we're talking about it in our classes, but we're actually, this is great, Bob, right? We're actually seeing it happen in cities like Minneapolis, right? And Seattle and other cities. They are making cities that, if the rezonings, right, to end single family zoning, as the density, hopefully, we see some LA is, in San Diego are already experiencing increased density through a lot of these programs, ADUs and so forth. There's potential, right, for kind of another generation of not just transit, but biking and walking and so forth. So, I think it's very exciting. They're very engaged. They're very engaged in class and they're very engaged online, in these issues. And I see that actually, I think, particularly social media, I think that is actually starting to shape the conversation and legislation in a way that's very different from how it was in the past. And Bob can comment on that in RPA, but the tools for the kind of activist planner, this is the kind of stuff that, Davidoff, who founded our program, would have dreamed of, right? The ability to basically broadcast, these alternative visions.
Yeah, I very much agree about the idealism of planning students today. At the University of Michigan, so many of our students wind up working in Detroit, and your chapter was, should now be required reading, just to let them know, the difficulty. What so impresses me about them is that, they know this stuff. They know about the mistakes and what planners have done, and they're still willing try again to, with tremendous patience. Because I think what planners bring to the table is never, the finished plan or the imagined plan is really secondary to that. That's what I certainly learned from my research into the RPA, to that work of, bringing people together, of sitting through meetings, of communicating with journalists, all of these things that have become really the essence of planning now.
Yeah.
Well, it's always good to follow a disaster with hope. So yeah. I think this is probably the best place to wrap up, which has been a long session. So I'm very grateful for everybody who stuck with that. And we had so much to discuss and so much experience and intelligence to bring to it with these two participants tonight. So thank you, Nick, for your book, and thank you, Bob, for your books and for your discussion and participation. We always learn an incredible amount for you. So we hope everybody will join us for the following book talks this coming summer. Check our website. But for now, go back and review some of the Bob's first talk and some of the gentrification issues about New York that we looked at with Brian Goldberg and Goldstein on Harlem, and on the South Bronx with Jill Jones. So it's been a good urban semester for us. So it's time for if not graduation, semesters ends, finals are over. So thank you guys for being with us tonight, and everybody else in the audience. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, Carol.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.